Well, there are tons, absolutely tons of father-son moments in the movies. Great, maybe even all already have examples coming to mind. Great one seem without number. We could speak of Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, where he and his father, Henry, play a large role in defeating the Nazis once again, as happens in every movie. Or we can talk about Finding Nemo, remember, where Marlin finally not only finds and reconnects with Nemo, but learns to let go in the end. What a wonderful moment. Or Lion King with Mufasa and Simba, and that relationship growing even though one has died. Or perhaps even if you're a darker kind of personality, Andrew, thinking of you here, maybe you think The Road. He's not here. You can tell him this. The Road, or The Road to Perdition, where there's a dystopian, apocalyptic future, or mafia father-son movies. Perhaps those come to mind. My favorite father-son movie, I think, that comes to mind for me is the one from, it's an old movie. It's called October Sky. Has anybody seen this? Yes. It's like a moment. It's set in West Virginia. This was like mid, I think, 2000s perhaps when this came out. But anyway, it's a coal mining town. Everybody in this town grows up with coal miner fathers, and all the sons then grow up. If they finish high school, they all go into the mines. Well, this one particular miner is very well known and respected. I don't know if he's the foreman of the mine, but he seems to be a guy that's in charge of much of the town. He's got two sons. Jim, who is the star quarterback on the high school football team, gets a scholarship and goes off to college. So in a sense, the father's already disappointed in this son because he's not going to be going into the mines, but he's a manly man, so he's very proud of this son. Well, his younger son, Homer, one day was outside looking up at the night sky, and he saw the satellite Sputnik go across, and all of a sudden he wants to become a rocket scientist. This little boy from a coal mining town in West Virginia then strikes up this passion for science and all things rocketry, if that's even a word. Well, their relationship, obviously, as you can imagine, gets real rocky real quick. Then it has a wonderful reuniting moment at the end where the dad finally comes around and realizes that this just might be the best thing for his boy, and he gets to hit the button to launch the last rocket in the movie. It's a wonderful father-son moment. If you've not seen it, you should see it. Well, the Bible also has wonderful father-son moments. And as we come to Genesis 46 this morning, we come to one of the best father-son moments in Scripture, when Jacob, after years and years of believing and living with and thinking that his son Joseph has died, here in our chapter today, he gets to reunite with him. It's a precious moment indeed, as there are so many other riches we can glean from this chapter. There are three headings that we'll work through to get through the whole chapter today, these 34 verses. First, see the first four verses, the vision. Genesis 46, verse 1 to 4. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." Well, we have now seen in our time together in Genesis, Joseph's brothers make two journeys back and forth to Egypt to get food in the midst of the famine that was going on in this region. The first two involved going, like I said, for the necessity of getting food, and on those journeys, there was always a sense of great fear, guilt, and trepidation because of Joseph. They didn't know this was Joseph, but Joseph recognizes the brothers, and time again, he puts test to these brothers again. Test this, test that, test them on this to see if they are the same men they once were that treated him so horribly when he was 17. See if they've changed at all. And so these trips were very dark and dreadful moments for the brothers. But this third trip is different, because on the end of the second trip, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. They reunite and reconcile. Then he invites them to go get dad and all the family, and invites the whole family to move back and settle in Egypt, down in the land of Goshen. So as verse 1 begins, this journey, third and final one to go move there, begins. Notice, though, Jacob starts this by leading everybody down to Beersheba. This is something to notice. It's not just a throwaway detail. As Jacob long ago in chapter 28, as he was entering into the promised land for the very first time, it was Beersheba that he came to worship the Lord and offer sacrifice. And now, ironically and somewhat wonderfully, it is Beersheba that is the place he goes as he exits the promised land, and there he worships, he makes sacrifices to the Lord. But this time, God speaks to him. And this is very familial for Jacob. This ties him once again to his father Isaac, who was actually the one who built this altar in the first place in his own life, and to Abraham, who came to this site and worshiped as well. And so that Jacob now does this, it kind of have the full picture of the patriarchs at Beersheba with the Lord. It's a special site where many special memories occur. God speaks to him here at Beersheba. This is the last time where God will speak to someone in the book of Genesis directly. This is the last time it happens. The next time it happens is to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, 430 years later. It's Jacob here at Beersheba, and the next time God speaks audibly to someone will be Moses 430 years later. Well, let's look at what God says to Jacob. After the familiar introductions I think we've become accustomed to, and the many visions that God has given where he speaks to people in Genesis, God comes to Jacob with words of comfort and encouragement for Jacob not to fear, curious, but to go down to Egypt. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, which begs the question, why is Jacob afraid to go to Egypt? Why would Jacob be afraid to go down? Is he not eager to reunite with Joseph for the first time in over 20 years? Does he not greatly desire to see this son that he thought was dead but is now alive? Well, of course, that's going on in him. But what we might have forgotten is that Egypt does not hold a very particularly warm place in the heart, the mind, the soul of Jacob. Why? Well, for Abraham and Isaac, Egypt was not a place that they preferred, a place that they experienced as good, or a place that was to them something of rest and refuge. If you remember Genesis 12, way back long ago, it was Egypt where Abraham made the first lie about his wife and experienced all kinds of ordeal because of his own foolishness. And then, later on in chapter 26, it was Egypt that God told Isaac to not go to when another famine was going on in his own time. Isaac's told, don't go to Egypt. I will provide for you in the promised land. I've brought you here. Don't leave the promised land to go back out into the wilderness. This is where I've called you. So famine's there. Famine is here. And more so, with the mention of the promised land, we think of the great promises made to Abraham, to him and his descendants, that God will make them into a great nation, that through this great nation, then God will bless every family in the world. And so then God calls Abraham to leave all that he knew and go off in to Canaan, the land of promise. So because of the greatness of this promise, and because this promise and its contents, I think, for this family filled out much of their identity and their purpose and their calling with God in the world, it would have taken an audible word from God for Jacob to leave the promised land. Because he would be thinking, if I leave, what comes of this great promise? This is where God has told me He will make us and our family and our descendants into a great nation that God will bless the world through. How then can I be the one in the family to shirk all of that and leave and go off into a pagan nation? So I do think Jacob is truly overjoyed and eager to reunite with Joseph. But I think there's a large part of him that is deathly afraid to leave this land. And so into that fear, God speaks a great word of comfort. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. How wonderful for Jacob to hear. In verse 3, not only the promises of Abraham and Isaac, the great and precious promises God made to them, repeated and reaffirmed now to him, but with now the new detail. I will do this to you, make you guys great into a great nation in Egypt. That is going to be the womb into which I will make you a great nation that He's calling them into. God will carry on this work outside of the promised land. It's actually this chapter, they all leave the promised land. They will not return, Israel will not return into it again until after the Exodus. So they're out for a long time now. But in verse 4, Jacob hears 3 more promises that fill out the events of this chapter. First, God will go down to Egypt with him. And so the journey will be a safe one because the Lord's presence will be with them. This would have been very meaningful to Jacob for him to hear that God will go down to Egypt with him, because as he came into the promised land in chapter 28, this is basically the exact same verbiage that God told him there. Go into the promised land, go into Canaan, for I will go with you. That's when he saw the great ladder with the angels of God ascending and descending, and then the presence of the Lord is with him. It's very familiar words for Jacob, so that he's hearing it again would have been very encouraging to him. So he hears this great promise. Second, God promises that He will bring His family up out of Egypt one day. Curious. This speaks of the events of the Exodus. Unbeknownst to him, God just told Jacob that He will save His people from the slavery that will happen to them in Egypt. This speaks of the Exodus here. Abraham even heard this in Genesis 15. Behold, your descendants will be mistreated and abused for hundreds of years, but when the sins of the Amorites is completed, I will come rescue them. Jacob now hears something of the same thing, but he has no idea that the events of the Exodus are going to happen. And I think we need to look at this detail because we love and make much, as we ought to, of God's redeeming work in the Exodus, where he saved his people out of slavery with his strong and mighty hand. Yet, here, we learn the detail that it was God who first brought his people into Egypt. Yes, God saved them out of it, but it was God who first led and called his people into Egypt in the first place. One would not be out of bounds to then ask the question, why would God call his people into such a place where such suffering would happen, only to then, in his perfect time, call them out again? Is God just mean like this? What's he up to in doing this with his people? The question's understandable, but I don't think the question should really surprise us, because this is so often what God does with us, isn't it? God matures and grows his people, not in seasons of great comfort, in seasons where the pavement is very smooth. God matures and grows his people in the school of suffering. And none of us are filling out that application to get into the school. We're not signing up to get into this as if we're like, yeah, if only I can get in there and then mature through these grades, just get severer and severer and severer. No, God enrolls us and we find ourselves on the first day of class like, why am I here? This is so often what God does in his great plans and purposes for us. So is it sobering to hear that God sometimes leads us straight into difficult places? Yes, it is sobering. But is it not also greatly comforting that God is not only the one who leads us in, but he's the one who keeps us while we're in, and he's the one who in his great time will also save us out of there too. Third and lastly, we're still in verse 4. God says he will give Jacob a peaceful death with his son Joseph beside him. This is an unusual promise, an unusual word of comfort, but it's a very moving one, I think, as well. I'm in my 40s now. I didn't think about this probably until recent years. But as you age, you break down, you wear down, especially as you grow nearer to the end and as you see friends nearing the end. And you do funeral after funeral after funeral for not only family members but great and dear friends. You see in many people and in yourself that a fear of death rises in you. Not so much that death will happen, but how death will happen. I think R.C. Sproul said it the best. I don't fear death. Death has been defeated. I fear the dying process and how that's going to come about. I don't fear it. The destination, the road might be squirrely. I think that's honest. I think that's something of what Jacob has felt. He has described his life in other places to be short. Even there's 130 by the time he meets Pharaoh in the next chapter. Short and full of trouble. But now he hears from God that his end will be peaceful and with his son. I think it does take some years under your belt to hear that and get the comfort that's supposed to be there. He thought that this son was dead. But now he hears that this son that he thought was dead will now be with him at his death. And this man, who is old and weak, who has had nothing but trouble his whole days because of his own folly, he now gets the word that he will die in peace. That is great comfort for old, weak Jacob. You take all these things together in verse 3 and 4, this is mighty encouragement for this man. Well, that's the vision at Beersheba as he now will lead all Israel out of the promised land into pagan Egypt. Let's look at that now. That's our second heading, the journey, verse 5 to 27. I do ask for your patience as these names are not names we're used to hearing. So hang in there with me I'll do my best as we read this big long list. Then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. Now these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. Jacob and his sons: Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and the sons of Reuben: Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. The sons of Simeon: Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah: Onan, Shelah, Perez, and Zerah, but and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Issachar: Tola, Puva, Yob, Shimron. The sons of Zebulun: Sered, Elon, and Jahleel. These are the sons of Leah, whom she born to Jacob in Paddan Aram, together with his daughter Dinah. Altogether, his sons and his daughters numbered 33. The sons of Gad: Ziphion, Haggai, Shuni, Esbon, Eri, Erodi, Ereli. The sons of Asher: Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, Beriah, with Sarah their sister. And the sons of Beriah: Heber and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to Leah his daughter, and these she bore to Jacob, 16 persons. The sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife: Joseph and Benjamin. And to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, bore to him. And the sons of Benjamin: Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ahi, Rosh, Mapim, Hapim, and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel, whom were born to Jacob, 14 persons in all. The son of Dan: Hashim. The sons of Naphtali: Jaziel, Guni, Jezer, and Shalem. These are the sons of Bilhah, whom Laban gave to Rachel his daughter, and these she bore to Jacob, 7 persons in all. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. On first glance, kind of recover from that big long moment. On first glance, you might conclude this middle section, as we so often do, right? This is just a bunch of names. Like you get to the first one, you read it, and then you're like skimming, when does it stop? Okay, now I can pick back up in verse 27. 70, I got it. Well, that is kind of something that's going on here. I mean, this section is given to us for one gigantically large purpose, to let us know that not only are we reading Jacob is moving to Egypt, but Israel Not just the person, Jacob's new name, but the people, all of them. The nation is moving. They're going out of the promised land into Egypt. That's the big idea here, that we get the list of all the names. But all the names, I think, do indicate one big theme that I'd like to draw your attention to before moving on to the last heading here. In verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, and verse 27, there's one phrase that's repeated once in each of those 4 verses. We read that all Israel, quote, came into Egypt. This phrase, came into Egypt, is one that in other parts of Genesis, you might think, well, where are we going to hear this? This kind of same formulaic of coming into somewhere really only occurs in one other spot. It's in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. When it says again and again in those chapters that Noah and his family came into the ark. And so because that's present there, with Noah and his family coming into the ark, and because it's present here with Jacob and his family coming into Egypt, automatically means there's something for us to learn in these two situations that's similar. Well, what was going on with Noah? The ark was God's means of preserving his people through the flood so that afterwards they can come out and become the great nation that he had in store for them. We know that. The same kind of meaning, the preserving idea, is present here. It's not a flood this time, but it's a famine. And so Jacob and his family are coming into Egypt. Egypt is a new kind of ark. Ironically, a pagan nation kind of functions as a preserving element for Jacob and his family, so that at the end of it, they will come out the great nation that God intends them to be. The two parallels here are meant for us to see. Remember, the author being Moses, because they all just experienced coming out of Egypt, the great people that they are, going in back for the first time since they left in this chapter into the promised land. So he not only wants to tell them their family history, he wants to show them how God has preserved them throughout the ages. Just as God preserved Noah and his family in the days of the flood through the ark, so too God is preserving Jacob and his family in the days of famine by using Egypt, a place you'd never expect God's people to flourish and grow. They just so happen to do, not because of happenstance, but because of God, which is grace to Israel. Because you might wonder and worry, well, goodness, what's going to become of the great promises, the covenant promises made to Abraham? If these people kind of integrate themselves into Egyptian society and culture, they'll lose their identity as a people. And yet, as we see it worked out in the last heading, the plan gets put in place to where all of Israel can be in Egypt and continue to be Israel while not losing any of their identity as a people. Only God could set up a thing with the king of Pharaoh even commanding this to happen. So let's look at that now, our last heading, the reunion, in verse 28 to 34. He had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" you shall say, "Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Well, the long-awaited moment, the reunion finally arrives. Judah goes on ahead of the family. Joseph hears that they've arrived, so he gets his royal entourage ready, chariot and all, and heads out to Goshen to see his brothers again and his father. It's the end of the movie moment and all those father-son moments where the music is just soaring and everything happens and everyone's crying if they're aware of what's going on watching these movies. Well, Joseph arrived. He saw Jacob after 22 years of separation. They embrace, and it not only says that they weep on each other's neck, but they do this for a good long while. Like, it's one of those moments where you cry till like you just like no more wet is happening. Like, you're done. Your dry tears now are happening. This is what's going on with these two. And Jacob, from this meeting, says, "I am ready to die." Again, we're like, Jacob, we get it, but how again comforting? Like, he's holding on for this moment. He's waiting for this. "Now I am ready to die, for I have seen your face." This reminds us, I think it ought to remind us of another moment in Genesis where Jacob saw another face and was astonished that he was still alive. You remember in the great wrestling match of chapter 32, he sees God face to face and is stunned that he is still living. Take that picture, reverse it, and that's what's going on here before Joseph. After seeing Joseph's face, he concludes that he no longer needs to live. He's not stunned that he's still alive after seeing a face. He sees the face he thought was dead, and he says, "I no longer need to be alive." This is chapter 46's way of saying what chapter 45 did at the end. It is enough. It's a heart that's content, and it's a heart that is happy in what is going on. And I think I can say, for an old man, this is good. Because what do we rarely see in old men? Contentment. I mean, I know this. I know you guys. I know old men. It is not a rare occurrence to go to dinner with Boohead, Walter, my father-in-law, and to him, it's $4 for sweet tea. Perhaps you guys have heard him say this when you've been at lunch with him. I'm going to say this in second service too, and he's like, "Yeah, it's crazy. I remember when it was 75 cents. Ironically, I've started saying things like this. "I remember when Waffle House was $5.59 for All-Star breakfast. Now it's $13. It is rare to find a young man that is humble. It is just as rare to find an older man that is content. That's what we see in Jacob in this chapter. And it ought to be beautiful for us to see. We rejoice in his joy, in his willingness to embrace death as a warm friend upon seeing the face of Joseph. After this, Joseph gets ingenuitive and works out a plan that guarantees a safe place for his family, that they won't just be blended in with the rest of Egyptian culture and society. So he's got the plan with speeches and all that he shares with his family, that he will ensure that Goshen is indeed given to them. And it all hinges on him telling Pharaoh, my family are shepherds, and then his family coming to Pharaoh and saying, say that you are shepherds. They don't like shepherds, but they don't want to leave you alone because you're not Egyptians and you're in Egypt, so they're going to want to keep an eye on you, but you're shepherds, so they're not going to want to be very close to you. So make sure you say this, and then you'll still be part of Egypt, but you'll be far enough away not to bother, but not too far away where they won't know what you're doing. Which kind of gives us a hint. There might be coming a Pharaoh who will not be okay with this. But for now, everything goes as planned. They settle in the land of Goshen. There are many things we could focus on here to bring this to a conclusion and apply this chapter to ourselves and its various points and themes and ebbing and flowing. But I'd like to point out that the whole trajectory of the chapter, the whole posture of the chapter ought to be, I think, one of our biggest takeaways. This chapter is all about Jacob being called out of what he knows into the unknown, into a land he had not been to before. It sounds very similar and familiar to what Abraham. It's exactly the same as what Abraham, who was called by God to leave all he knew, Ur and the Chaldees, to go off into Canaan, a land he had never been to before, and to trust this God all of a sudden that it seems to be meeting for the first time. This is very similar to Abraham, but now in a reverse manner, here many years later, the grandson of Abraham, Jacob, is called to do the same thing. Leave a land you know and go out into a future that you don't know. And as Abraham was then, Jacob is now fearful. Isn't that the natural response? You sense God moving and calling you into something different. What is this going to be? You get news of something new. What is this going to be? Fear strikes. Unknown happens. Darkness before you. But in verse 3 and 4, God gives the promise of His presence. I will go down with you into Egypt. And so off he went. Yes, into the unknown, but with the Lord. With the Lord. And of course, in time, Israel in Goshen would grow, very fruitful, very multiplying. There's a bunch of them. There's millions of them, perhaps, at this time. And they're growing and growing and growing. And of course, our fear comes true. A new Pharaoh arises that has no concern for Joseph and his history. And so he enslaves this random group of people that's just been blossoming in his own land. And he's like, hey, all of our building projects would get done if we just recruit all them and not pay them to do it. And so someone's like, good idea. And so they enslave the whole nation. But when it came time for God to save them once again, he sent Moses, who had once, ironically, fled Egypt after murdering someone. Now he's called by God to go back into it and then to bring them out. And what is Moses' response? Fear. Yet God tells Moses in Exodus 3:12, I will be with you. Later on, as the nation has come out and is standing on the banks of the Jordan, looking over the river at the promised land, They are naturally fearful of the gigantic inhabitants of the land. How can we dispossess them and come into the inheritance that God has for us, the promised land that we once were in, but we've been out and now we're going back into? Yet in Deuteronomy 31:6, God says, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." And the story goes on and on and on as the people ebb and flow in their obedience. But whether they're in the promised land or far off in exile, all along, God is reminding His people that He is always with them, that He will never leave them, He will never forsake them, and God would remain with His people until the time when He would come in the person of His Son to dwell in their midst. And His name was Emmanuel, God with us. And after His resurrection, Jesus, at the end of the Great Commission, said, "And behold, I am with you, even to the end of the age." And as the end of the age comes, Jesus tells us that He will return to be with us forever. In all those father-son stories that we began the sermon with, those moments are so great because in the reunions, there's a restoration, a reconciliation that's so great. They enjoy one another's presence once again, and they that were separated and estranged are now with each other once again. Well, how much greater is the great story where God does all the work to get rid of the separation and reconcile Himself to a people that He has chosen. And by grace and grace and grace and reminder and reminder and reminder until the end comes and off into eternity, He's telling us, "I will always be with you." We will never once again be separated. You will never be alone. You will never have to just fend for yourself. So whatever tomorrow brings, whether it tests our faith or fills our hearts with songs of praise, we can trust that God will never leave us on our own, but will be with us forever and ever. Rejoice, rest in this, and in all the unknown, know God, nothing is unknown to Him. With Him, we are ever safe.